The demolition crew found the work gloves first, buried beneath 26 years of dried grain dust at the bottom of the old Holstrom family silo on March 8, 2024. What should have been a routine farm structure renovation in rural Millfield, Wisconsin would instead uncover one of the state's most heartbreaking cold cases. It exposed how a trusted neighbor and fellow farmer had murdered 24-year-old David Holstrom in June 1998. He staged his disappearance to look like a young man fleeing family responsibilities, and then attended his memorial service while David's body remained hidden just 300 feet from where his grieving parents continued running the dairy farm that had been in their family for 4 generations. Jake Morrison had been running demolition projects across southern Wisconsin for 18 years, long enough to know that old farm structures always contained surprises, abandoned equipment, forgotten tools, occasionally a nest of raccoons or barn owls that had claimed the space as their own. But standing at the base of the Holstrom silo on that cold March morning, staring at the pair of leather work gloves his crew member had just pulled from the concrete floor, Morrison felt something he'd never experienced on a job site before. The gloves weren't weathered or rotted like abandoned items should be after decades of exposure. They were preserved, protected by the sealed environment of the silo's base, and they still bore the distinctive logo of Patterson Farm Supply, the local equipment dealer that had closed its doors in 2015. Morrison's crew had been hired by Martha Holstrom, the 87-year-old matriarch of the Holstrom dairy farm, to demolish the unused grain silo that had stood dormant since 2010. The structure had become unstable, its concrete walls showing cracks that posed a danger to the farm's operations. Martha had finally decided it was time to remove the last physical reminder of the farm's transition from traditional grain storage to modern facilities. The demolition was supposed to take 3 days, 1 day to prepare the site, 1 day to bring down the structure, and a final day for cleanup and removal of debris. Instead, it would take 3 hours to transform a routine construction project into a crime scene that would reopen wounds the Millfield community had spent 26 years trying to heal. The Holstrom farm stretched across 240 acres of rolling Wisconsin farmland, 12 miles west of Millfield, in an area where family names on mailboxes had remained unchanged for generations. The property had been homesteaded by Gustav Holstrom in 1887, a Swedish immigrant who'd recognized the potential of Wisconsin's rich soil and moderate climate for dairy farming. Gustav's son, Eric, had expanded the operation. His grandson, Carl, had modernized it with machinery and improved breeding techniques. And Carl's son, David, had been raised with the expectation that he would become the 4th generation to work the land and maintain the family legacy. David Holstrom had been born on April 3, 1974, the only child of Carl and Martha Holstrom, who had married late in life and considered their son a blessing they'd almost given up hoping for. David grew up surrounded by the rhythms of farm life, waking before dawn to help with milking, learning to drive tractors before he could legally operate a car on public roads, and developing the kind of quiet competence that came from years of working alongside his father in all weather and all seasons. Teachers at Millfield High School remembered David as a serious student who never missed school but whose real education happened at home. He absorbed generations of accumulated knowledge about land management, animal husbandry, and the delicate economics of small-scale dairy farming. Unlike many of his classmates who left for college and never returned, David had been clear about his intentions from an early age. He would graduate high school, work the farm full-time with his father, and eventually take over when Carl retired. The plan was simple, traditional, and deeply satisfying to Carl and Martha, who had worried about the farm's future as they watched other local operations fold or get absorbed by corporate agriculture. David represented continuity, the promise that the Holstrom name would remain on the land for at least another generation. The relationship between the Holstroms and their neighbor Robert Patterson had been complicated for as long as anyone in Millfield could remember. Patterson owned the adjacent farm, a smaller operation of 160 acres that he'd inherited from his father in 1983. Where the Holstroms had always been prudent, cautious, and forward-thinking about modernization, Patterson had been impulsive, resistant to change, and chronically in debt. The two families had maintained cordial relations over the years, helping each other during harvest season and sharing equipment when necessary, but there had always been an undercurrent of tension that dated back to a property line dispute in the 1960s that had been settled in the Holstrom's favor. By 1998, Patterson's financial situation had deteriorated to crisis levels. Years of poor management, coupled with falling milk prices and increasing operating costs, had left him facing foreclosure on his farm. Patterson had approached Carl Holstrom in May 1998 with a proposal to sell 40 acres of his land to the Holstroms, hoping to raise enough money to save the remaining property and restructure his debts. Carl had made an offer that Patterson considered insultingly low, arguing that the land's condition reflected years of poor soil management and would require significant investment to bring it up to the Holstrom farm's standards. The rejection had festered in Patterson for weeks, transforming from disappointment into resentment and eventually into something darker. He watched David Holstrom, barely 24 years old, working land that would someday be his, embodying a future that Patterson's own children would never have because his farm was dying. Patterson's two sons had long since left Wisconsin, pursuing careers in Minneapolis that had nothing to do with agriculture, showing no interest in saving the family operation, even if such salvation had been possible. The contrast between David's commitment and his own son's abandonment felt like a personal indictment, and Patterson's bitterness found a convenient target in the young man who represented everything he'd failed to achieve. June 15, 1998, started like any other summer morning on the Holstrom farm. David woke at 4:30 a.m., pulled on his work clothes and boots, and headed to the milking barn, where his father was already preparing equipment. They worked in comfortable silence for 2 hours, the kind of wordless coordination that came from years of shared routine. By 7 a.m., the morning milking was complete, and David returned to the house for breakfast while Carl handled the automated cleaning system that had been one of their most significant recent investments. Martha had prepared the same breakfast she'd made for 30 years. Scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, toast with homemade strawberry jam, and coffee strong enough to carry them through whatever the day demanded. David ate mechanically, his mind already running through the day's tasks. The south pasture fence needed repair. Several cows were due for health checks, and he wanted to finish servicing the combine before the week ended. It was the kind of endless to-do list that defined farming life, where completed tasks simply made room for the next urgent priority. Around 9 a.m., David told his mother he was heading to Patterson Farm Supply to pick up replacement parts for the fence project. The errand should have taken an hour at most. Patterson's store was only 3 miles down County Road M, and David had made similar trips hundreds of times. Martha watched him drive away in the farm's aging pickup truck, raising one hand in a casual wave that would haunt her for the next 26 years. What happened during the next 2 hours would remain partially mysterious, even after the truth finally emerged in 2024. But the outline was clear enough to construct a devastating narrative. David had arrived at Patterson Farm Supply around 9:15 a.m., where Robert Patterson was working alone, his part-time employee having called in sick that morning. The two men had been alone in the store, and at some point their interaction had escalated from a business transaction into a confrontation that ended with David's death. Patterson would later claim, during his eventual confession in 2024, that he hadn't planned to kill David Holstrom. The violence had emerged from an argument about the land sale that had been rejected weeks earlier. Patterson brought it up again, and David unwittingly said something that Patterson interpreted as arrogant or dismissive. The exact words that triggered Patterson's rage would never be known with certainty, but the result was unmistakable. Patterson had grabbed a heavy wrench from his workbench and struck David in the head, with enough force to cause immediate loss of consciousness and ultimately death. For several hours, Patterson had panicked, pacing around his store with David's body lying where it had fallen, trying to figure out what to do. He couldn't call for help without confessing to murder. He couldn't simply leave the body and hope it wouldn't be connected to him. The Holstrom truck was parked outside his store in plain view of County Road M, and it was only a matter of time before someone noticed and wondered why David would leave his vehicle at Patterson's place for so long. The solution Patterson devised was both cunning and cruel. He would stage David's disappearance to look like a voluntary departure. He would make it appear that the young man had decided to abandon farm life and his family responsibilities. Patterson had access to David's wallet, which contained his driver's license, credit cards, and some cash. More importantly, Patterson knew the Holstrom farm well enough to know where David kept personal items. He understood the family dynamics well enough to craft a story that would be believable to people who didn't want to believe the worst. Patterson waited until after dark on June 15th, then loaded David's body into the back of the Holstrom truck and drove it back to the farm, using back roads to minimize the chance of being seen. He parked the truck in its usual spot near the barn, taking care to position it exactly as David would have. Then Patterson carried David's body to the old grain silo. The structure had been built in the 1950s and was still used for overflow storage during harvest season, but remained empty for most of the year. The silo's design made it ideal for Patterson's terrible purpose. The structure had a small access door at ground level for filling and a sealed base section that could only be opened from outside. Patterson placed David's body in the base section, sealed it shut, and arranged the scene to ensure no one would have reason to open it. Then he returned to the farmhouse and, using paper he'd taken from David's truck, wrote a brief note in block letters designed to disguise any handwriting analysis. If you're following this story so far, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will show you how evil can hide in plain sight for decades. The note Patterson left was brief and devastating in its cruelty. "I can't do this anymore. I need to find out who I am away from the farm. Don't look for me. I'll be okay. David." He placed the note on the kitchen table where Martha would find it, weighted down with David's work gloves that Patterson had deliberately left behind to make it appear that David had come home, made his decision, and left again. When Carl and Martha discovered the note around 6 p.m. after spending the day increasingly worried about David's absence, their first reaction was disbelief. David wouldn't leave without talking to them. David loved the farm. David understood his responsibilities. But the note was there, in their son's own handwriting as far as they could tell, and the truck was parked outside, suggesting he'd come home and left again on foot or gotten a ride with someone else. Carl called the Millfield Police Department at 7:30 p.m. to report his son missing. The officer who took the report was skeptical about treating it as an emergency. David was 24 years old, an adult who had apparently left a note explaining his departure. While the circumstances were unusual, they didn't suggest foul play or immediate danger. The officer advised Carl to wait a few days, suggesting that David might be staying with friends and would probably return once he'd had time to think things through. The first week after David's disappearance was agony for Carl and Martha. They called everyone they could think of: David's former classmates, distant relatives, local businesses where he might have been seen. The responses were all negative. No one had seen David. No one had heard from him. It was as if he'd simply evaporated from Millfield on June 15th, leaving behind only a brief note and a truck full of questions. Robert Patterson inserted himself into the search efforts immediately, presenting himself as a concerned neighbor and family friend who wanted to help. He joined the search parties that combed local areas where David might have gone on foot. He made sympathetic visits to the Holstrom house, offering comfort and practical assistance. He even helped Carl with farm chores during those first difficult weeks, knowing that dairy cows don't stop needing care just because a family is in crisis. The investigation, such as it was, focused on the theory that David had experienced some kind of crisis or breakdown that prompted him to leave. Police looked into his bank account and found no activity after June 15th. They checked with bus companies and train stations in nearby cities, but found no record of anyone matching David's description purchasing tickets. His social security number showed no employment activity. It was as if David Holstrom had decided to disappear so completely that he left no trail for anyone to follow. By August 1998, the active investigation had essentially stopped. David's case remained open, and his information was entered into databases for missing persons, but without any evidence of foul play or leads suggesting where he might have gone, there was little for investigators to pursue. Carl and Martha were left to navigate their grief and confusion alone, trying to understand how the son they'd raised to be responsible and committed had simply walked away from everything he'd known. The community's response split along uncomfortable lines. Some people sympathized with Carl and Martha, believing that David must have felt overwhelmed by expectations and needed space to discover his own path. Others whispered that there must have been problems in the family that no one knew about, tensions that had driven David to such a dramatic departure. A few suggested that David might have had a secret girlfriend or other commitments that his parents didn't know about, and that he'd chosen those over farm life. The speculation was torture for Carl and Martha, who found themselves defending their relationship with their son while simultaneously grieving his absence and struggling to understand his motivations. The hardest part was not knowing whether David was alive somewhere, starting a new life without them, or whether something terrible had happened that they might never learn about. The uncertainty was a wound that never healed, a constant ache that colored every aspect of their remaining years. Martha stopped cooking David's favorite meals because the sight of them made her cry. Carl avoided going into David's bedroom, which remained exactly as he'd left it on June 15th, as if preserving the space might somehow bring him back. They continued running the farm because it was all they knew how to do, but the work felt hollow without David there to share it and eventually inherit it. Robert Patterson remained a constant presence in their lives during those years, the helpful neighbor who never seemed to tire of offering assistance. He helped with repairs, loaned equipment when the Holstrom's machinery broke down, and was always available when Carl needed an extra pair of hands for difficult tasks. Martha baked him pies and invited him for Sunday dinners, grateful for his friendship during their darkest time. Neither of them suspected that their trusted neighbor was the reason their son would never come home. The years accumulated slowly, each one adding weight to the possibility that David was gone forever. Carl developed heart problems that his doctor attributed to stress and age. Martha's hair turned completely white seemingly overnight. They attended church every Sunday and participated in community events, but there was a distance about them, as if part of them remained frozen in June 1998, waiting for answers that never came. Carl Holstrom died on November 3, 2019 at the age of 82, never knowing what had happened to his son. His final words to Martha, whispered from his hospital bed, were, "I'm sorry I couldn't find him." Martha held his hand and told him it wasn't his fault, but they both knew that David's absence had broken something fundamental in Carl that never healed. Robert Patterson attended Carl's funeral, standing among the mourners with an appropriate expression of sadness, offering condolences to Martha that she accepted with gratitude. Martha continued running the farm after Carl's death, hiring help when necessary, but refusing to give up the land that 4 generations of Holstroms had worked. She was driven partly by stubbornness, partly by the fading hope that David might someday return and find his family's legacy intact, and partly by the knowledge that she simply didn't know how to be anything other than a farmer's wife. The work gave her life structure and purpose, even as her body grew frail and her mind increasingly turned to memories of better days. By 2024, Martha was 87 years old and facing the reality that she couldn't maintain the farm much longer. Her nephew had been helping with operations for several years, and they'd agreed that within the next few years, they would need to sell the property or lease it to a larger operation. As part of preparing the farm for whatever transition lay ahead, Martha decided to address safety concerns that had been neglected during her years of merely surviving. The old grain silo was one of several structures that needed attention. The silo had stood unused since 2010, when the farm had transitioned to exclusively using newer storage facilities. Martha had occasionally considered having it removed, but had never quite been able to commit to the expense and disruption. By early 2024, however, the structure's deteriorating condition could no longer be ignored. Large cracks had appeared in the concrete walls, and Martha's insurance agent had warned that the silo posed liability risks if it collapsed and caused property damage or injured someone. Martha hired Wisconsin Structures, a demolition company based in Madison that specialized in agricultural buildings, to handle the removal. Jake Morrison had submitted the lowest bid and had provided references from similar projects across the state. The contract was signed in February 2024, with work scheduled to begin as soon as weather permitted safe operations. March 8th arrived with clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s, ideal conditions for the kind of controlled demolition that Morrison's crew would perform. The plan was straightforward: seal off the area around the silo, use heavy equipment to weaken the structure's base, and then bring down the walls in a controlled collapse that would minimize debris spread. Morrison's crew arrived at 7 a.m. and spent the first hour setting up equipment and reviewing safety procedures. Around 9 a.m., Morrison directed 2 crew members to enter the silo's base level to assess the interior condition before beginning demolition. Tim Bradford and Miguel Santos, both experienced demolition workers, entered through the small access door at ground level, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of the sealed interior. The space was approximately 15 feet in diameter, with concrete walls that rose into the main storage area above. The floor was covered with several inches of dried grain dust and debris that had accumulated over decades of use. Santos noticed the work gloves first, partially buried in the dust near the far wall. "Hey, somebody left their gloves in here," he called to Bradford, bending down to pick them up. As Santos lifted the gloves, more dust shifted, and both men saw what had been hidden beneath: a leather belt with a distinctive buckle showing the logo of Millfield High School. Then they saw the bones, unmistakably human, arranged in a way that suggested a body had been placed there deliberately and had remained undisturbed for years. Bradford immediately called for Morrison while Santos backed toward the door, his hands shaking as he dropped the gloves he'd been holding. Morrison's first call was to Martha Holstrom, who was in the farmhouse preparing lunch. His second call was to the Millfield Police Department. By 10:30 a.m., the demolition site had been transformed into a crime scene, with yellow tape cordoning off the area, and investigators beginning the careful process of documenting and recovering human remains that had been sealed in darkness for more than 2 decades. Detective Sarah Mitchell from the Wisconsin Department of Criminal Investigation arrived at the Holstrom farm at 1 p.m., having driven from Madison as soon as she received notification about the discovery. Mitchell was 42 years old, a 15-year veteran of criminal investigation who specialized in cold cases. She'd worked dozens of cases involving remains discovered years or decades after death, and she understood that each one represented not just a forensic puzzle, but also families who'd been living with uncertainty and grief. Martha Holstrom sat in her kitchen with her nephew Peter, both of them pale and silent, as they tried to process what Mitchell had told them. Human remains had been found in the silo. Initial examination suggested they'd been there for many years, possibly decades. DNA testing would be necessary to confirm identity, but there were personal effects recovered with the remains that suggested the possibility everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say aloud. The belt buckle that Santos had found bore David Holstrom's initials, engraved on the back by Martha herself when she'd given it to him for his 18th birthday. The work gloves, though degraded, were similar to ones David had owned. Most significantly, the remains were located in a part of the farm David would have known well, sealed in a way that suggested deliberate concealment rather than accidental death. Mitchell explained that the investigation would take time. The remains would be transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis, including DNA extraction and comparison against the genetic profile that Martha could provide through her own DNA or through items belonging to David that might still contain his genetic material. The process could take weeks or even months, depending on the condition of the remains and the complexity of the analysis required. For Martha, the discovery brought both relief and renewed anguish. If the remains were David's, it meant he hadn't abandoned the family. He hadn't rejected them or chosen a different life over the one they'd offered him. But it also meant he'd been dead all along, possibly killed and hidden by someone who'd let them suffer 26 years of uncertainty when they could have had answers and closure. The grief that Martha had learned to carry as a dull, constant ache suddenly became sharp and immediate again, as if David had just died instead of being gone for more than a quarter century. The forensic analysis confirmed what everyone suspected. DNA extracted from the remains matched Martha's genetic profile with sufficient markers to establish a maternal relationship. David Holstrom had never left the farm in June 1998. He'd been murdered and concealed in the silo, hidden in plain sight while his parents continued their daily routines just hundreds of feet away, unaware that their son's body was so close they'd have passed it countless times without knowing. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The injury would have caused immediate loss of consciousness and death within minutes. There was no evidence of other injuries or signs of prolonged suffering, small mercies that Mitchell emphasized when delivering the information to Martha. Whatever had happened to David, it had happened quickly. The investigation into David's murder began with a comprehensive review of the 1998 missing person case and interviews with everyone who'd been connected to David or the Holstrom farm during that period. Mitchell's team worked systematically through the list: former classmates, business associates, neighbors, anyone who might have had information about David's final days or who might have had reason to harm him. Robert Patterson's name appeared on that list as a neighbor and family friend, but initially he seemed like an unlikely suspect. Patterson was now 74 years old, still living on his farm, though he'd long since stopped active operations, and was leasing his land to a larger agricultural company. He'd been consistently helpful to the Holstrom family for decades, including during the immediate aftermath of David's disappearance. His alibi for June 15, 1998, such as it was, centered on being at his farm supply store, though there had been no witnesses to confirm his presence there during the specific hours when David had disappeared. The breakthrough in Patterson's involvement came not from witness statements or alibis, but from the physical evidence recovered with David's remains. Among the items found in the silo was a small metal tag that had fallen from a key ring, bearing the name and phone number of Patterson Farm Supply. The tag was distinctive enough that investigators remembered seeing similar tags in photographs from the 1998 investigation, where they'd been used as promotional items that Patterson had given to customers. Mitchell obtained a warrant to search Patterson's property and remaining business records, looking for any documentation that might place David at the farm supply store on June 15, 1998. What she found instead was a locked filing cabinet in Patterson's home office containing a journal that Patterson had apparently kept sporadically over the years. The entries were brief and often cryptic, but several from June and July 1998 were devastatingly clear about Patterson's guilt and his decades of living with that secret. The journal entry from June 16, 1998 read simply, "It's done. God forgive me for what I did to that boy. The look in Carl's eyes today will haunt me forever." Subsequent entries documented Patterson's psychological struggle with what he'd done, his nightmares about being discovered, and his growing realization that he'd destroyed multiple lives through his moment of rage. If this case is gripping you, and you want to see how justice unfolds, drop a quick like and share this with someone who needs to understand how important cold case work really is. Mitchell arrested Robert Patterson on April 15, 2024, charging him with first-degree murder in David Holstrom's death. Patterson's initial response was silence, sitting across from Mitchell in the interrogation room with tears streaming down his face, but no words coming out. After several hours and consultation with the public defender assigned to represent him, Patterson made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would confess fully and completely to what he'd done, hoping that honesty might bring some measure of peace to Martha Holstrom, and perhaps even to himself. The confession took 6 hours, with Patterson describing every detail of June 15, 1998 that he could remember. He explained the argument that had spiraled into violence, his panic afterward, and the calculation that had led him to stage David's disappearance. Most painfully, he described the 26 years of guilt that had followed, during which he'd maintained his relationship with Carl and Martha, while knowing he was the reason for their suffering. Patterson admitted that he'd almost confessed several times over the years. Carl's death in 2019 had particularly tormented him, knowing that the man had died without ever learning what had happened to his son. But Patterson had been a coward, he said, choosing his own freedom over the Holstrom's right to know the truth. Only the discovery of David's remains had made confession inevitable, and even then, Patterson acknowledged that without the journal evidence, he likely would have tried to maintain his innocence. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court as part of Patterson's legal proceedings revealed a complex portrait of guilt, rationalization, and compartmentalization. Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychologist with 25 years of experience, interviewed Patterson extensively and reviewed his journal entries, concluding that Patterson had experienced genuine remorse for his actions, but had lacked the moral courage to act on that remorse in ways that would have cost him personally. Dr. Chen explained that Patterson had managed to maintain his relationship with the Holstrom family by separating his identity as helpful neighbor from his identity as David's killer. This psychological splitting had allowed him to offer genuine assistance and compassion while avoiding confrontation with the full implications of what he'd done. The journal entries suggested that Patterson had experienced significant psychological distress over the years, but not enough to overcome his fundamental self-preservation instinct. The trial of Robert Patterson began in September 2024, held in the Millfield County Courthouse that served the rural community where both families had lived for generations. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Wheeler, presented overwhelming evidence of Patterson's guilt. The journal entries, the physical evidence from the silo, and Patterson's own detailed confession. The defense, while not contesting Patterson's guilt, focused on arguing for consideration of his age, health, and eventual cooperation when determining his sentence. The courtroom was filled every day with members of the farming community who'd known both families for decades. Some came to support Martha Holstrom, sitting behind her in silent solidarity as she heard the details of how her son had died. Others came out of morbid curiosity or a need to understand how someone they had all trusted could have committed such a terrible crime and hidden it for so long. The most powerful testimony came from Martha herself, who took the stand during the sentencing phase to deliver a victim impact statement that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. She spoke about 26 years of not knowing, of wondering if David was alive somewhere, hating his parents for driving him away. She described the guilt she'd carried, believing she must have failed as a mother for her son to leave without explanation. She talked about Carl's death and his final words, the regret that had consumed him because he'd never found their boy. "You took my son from me in 1998, Martha said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But you also took 26 years when I could have grieved properly, could have buried him next to his grandparents, could have let myself remember him without wondering if he was alive somewhere, not wanting me to find him. My husband died thinking he'd failed David. You could have told us the truth. You came to our house, ate our food, pretended to be our friend. That's the betrayal I'll never understand, Mr. Patterson. The murder was a moment of rage, but the lie was a choice you made every single day for 26 years. Patterson's own statement to the court was brief and filled with apologies that rang hollow to most observers. He acknowledged that nothing he said could undo what he'd done or restore what had been taken from the Holstrom family. He claimed that he'd been a coward and that his punishment was deserved. Whether his remorse was genuine or performative remained a subject of debate among those who'd known him, but the legal outcome was clear. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Robert Patterson to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, emphasizing that while the actual murder might have been spontaneous, the elaborate cover-up and decades of deception represented calculated, sustained criminal behavior that warranted the severest possible punishment. Patterson, now 74 years old and in declining health, would spend his remaining years in prison, unlikely to ever again see the farmland where he'd grown up and where he'd destroyed so many lives through a moment of violence and 26 years of lies. The resolution of David's case brought Martha a measure of peace she hadn't experienced since 1998, though it came mixed with grief over all the wasted years. She was finally able to bury her son in the family plot at Millfield Lutheran Cemetery, next to his father and grandparents. The funeral service drew hundreds of people, including many of David's former classmates, now middle-aged, who'd lived with their own questions about what happened to their friend. Martha established a memorial scholarship at Millfield High School in David's name, funded by compensation she received from Patterson's property sale that was ordered as part of his sentencing. The scholarship would help students from farming families pursue agricultural education, ensuring that David's legacy would continue supporting the kind of traditional family farming that he'd loved and that had been taken from him. The old silo where David's remains had been hidden was completely demolished within weeks of the discovery, with Martha insisting that no trace of it should remain. The site was cleared and eventually planted with wildflowers, creating a small memorial garden that Martha tended personally whenever her health permitted. A simple stone marker noted that this was a place of remembrance for David Holstrom, beloved son and farmer, whose life had been cut short but whose memory would endure. The impact of David's case extended beyond the Holstrom family to the wider farming community, forcing difficult conversations about trust, suspicion, and the secrets that people carry. Many residents found themselves reassessing relationships and wondering whether other seemingly friendly neighbors might be hiding dark secrets. The realization that Robert Patterson had maintained his deception for 26 years while actively participating in community life created a paranoia that would take years to overcome. For the investigators who worked the case, David's murder represented both success and frustration. Success in finally providing answers to a family that had suffered for decades, but frustration over the 26 years when the truth had been hidden, literally underfoot. Detective Mitchell would later say that the Holstrom case reinforced her belief that no case was ever truly cold, as long as someone was willing to keep searching for answers. The physical evidence that had seemed so minor when first discovered, work gloves, a belt buckle, a key ring tag, had proven crucial to identifying David and eventually leading to his killer. Mitchell emphasized in subsequent training sessions for other investigators that small details matter, that every piece of evidence should be preserved and documented carefully, because its significance might not be apparent until years or decades later, when new technology or new information provided context. The forensic techniques used to analyze David's remains represented significant advances over what had been available in 1998. DNA extraction methods had improved dramatically, allowing usable genetic profiles to be obtained from degraded biological material that would have been worthless to earlier generations of forensic scientists. The ability to establish identity through maternal DNA comparison had been refined to the point where relationships could be confirmed with extraordinary confidence, even when dealing with skeletal remains that had been exposed to harsh conditions. The psychological aspects of Patterson's case attracted attention from forensic psychologists, interested in understanding how seemingly ordinary people could commit serious crimes and then maintain normal social relationships while carrying enormous secrets. Dr. Chen's evaluation of Patterson became part of training materials used to help investigators recognize that criminals don't always fit stereotypical profiles, that people capable of murder might also be capable of genuine kindness in other contexts, and that the human capacity for compartmentalization was far greater than most people realized. The economic impact of David's murder on both families illustrated the long-term consequences of violent crime beyond the immediate victims. The Holstrom farm had suffered 26 years of operating without the additional labor and eventual succession planning that David would have provided. Carl's health problems and early death could reasonably be attributed at least in part to the stress of David's disappearance. The farm's future remained uncertain, with Martha's advancing age and no clear successor to maintain the family operation. Patterson's farm had already been in economic decline before 1998, but his crime had sealed its fate. The legal costs of his defense, combined with the restitution ordered as part of his sentencing, had forced the sale of property that had been in his family for generations. His own children, already estranged, severed all contact after learning about their father's crimes, leaving Patterson isolated even before his imprisonment. The media attention surrounding Patterson's arrest and trial brought national focus to Millfield, transforming the quiet farming community into a symbol of how darkness can hide behind rural American wholesomeness. Television news crews and true crime podcasters descended on the town, interviewing residents and creating content that often felt exploitative to locals who were trying to process their own feelings about the case. Martha declined almost all media requests, making only a single statement through her attorney emphasizing that she hoped David would be remembered for who he'd been rather than how he'd died. The theological and philosophical questions raised by Patterson's case were debated in churches and coffee shops throughout Millfield. How could someone commit murder and then live normally for 26 years? Was his apparent remorse, as documented in his journal, genuine or simply self-pity? Could someone who'd caused such suffering through deception ever truly be forgiven, either by society or by a higher power? These questions had no easy answers, but they reflected the community's struggle to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant about human nature and the capacity for evil in seemingly ordinary people. The legal precedent set by Patterson's case involved questions about evidence preservation, the admissibility of journal entries as confessions, and the appropriate sentencing for crimes that involved both immediate violence and extended periods of concealment and deception. Appeals courts would likely review aspects of the case for years to come, but the fundamental conviction seemed solid based on the combination of physical evidence, documented confession, and Patterson's own statements to investigators. For Martha Holstrom, now 88 years old and facing the final years of her life, the resolution brought a bittersweet closure. She finally knew what had happened to David and could properly grieve his death. But she would never recover the 26 years spent wondering and hoping. She would never have the conversations with her adult son that she'd imagined would never meet the grandchildren he might have given her, would never see him take over the farm, as 4 generations of Holstroms had done before him. On quiet mornings, Martha still woke at 4:30 a.m., her body trained by decades of farm routines even though she no longer performed the physical labor of milking and field work. She would make coffee in the kitchen where she'd found the fake note that had shaped 26 years of grief, looking out the window toward the spot where the silo had stood. The wildflower garden that had replaced it bloomed purple and yellow in summer, a small point of beauty that commemorated tragedy. The story of David Holstrom and Robert Patterson would become part of Millfield's history, told and retold with the embellishments and simplifications that come with repeated retellings. But at its core, the story remained simple and heartbreaking. A moment of rage, a cowardly decision to hide the consequences, and 26 years of compounded suffering that destroyed multiple families and shattered a community's sense of safety and trust. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you for caring about justice and remembering victims like David Holstrom. Subscribe to see more cases where truth eventually emerges no matter how long it's been buried. As of 2024, Martha continues living on the farm, though she's made arrangements for its eventual sale to a neighboring operation that will maintain it as agricultural land. She visits David's grave weekly, bringing fresh flowers and spending quiet moments telling him about the farm, the community, and the life he should have had. The conversations are one-sided now, but they bring Martha comfort in ways that 26 years of uncertainty never could. The final words belong to Detective Mitchell, who reflected on the case during a training session for other investigators. The Holstrom case reminds us that solving cold cases isn't just about scientific techniques or investigative procedures. It's about refusing to let victims be forgotten, about understanding that families deserve answers even decades after their loss, and about recognizing that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. David Holstrom was hidden for 26 years, but his story was finally told. That matters. It matters to his mother, to his community, and to every other family still waiting for answers about their own missing loved ones.